Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today we are going to do a deep dive into
Deep
exactly long-distance relationships.
Yeah.
And we found a really fascinating podcast episode called Love Connections, Navigating Long-Distance Relationships. Um, and, it really kind of got me thinking because it suggests
Mm-hmm.
that these relationships can not only work, but
Yeah.
actually thrive and be super successful.
Yeah.
And I'm super curious to kind of dig into
Yeah.
what makes that tick. What do you think?
Well, it is really interesting because the episode starts by exploring, why people choose this path. I mean, it's not always
Okay.
just about like love and bad timing.
Yeah.
You meet the one right before like a big move across the country or something like that.
Mhm.
There's often, I think, a deeper layer there.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
So it's more than just circumstance.
I think so. I think, for some people, they're actually drawn to the dynamics of distance. Maybe they thrive on like independence, or there's a certain level of like intensity or longing that fuels the connection. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, but of course, the podcast, also highlights the trade-offs,
Right.
things like potentially delaying, major life milestones or
Yeah.
having to navigate trust in a totally different way.
Yeah, that's true. I think it is easy to kind of romanticize that
Mm-hmm.
idea of long distance love.
Right.
But yeah, the reality is more complex.
Yeah, for sure.
And speaking of reality, like one thing this episode really hammers home is
Yes.
the importance of communication.
Yes.
But it goes beyond just talking more, right?
Absolutely. The episode really dives into like different communication styles
Oh, interesting.
and how those styles play out
Yeah.
in long distance relationships.
Mm-hmm.
For example, some couples might be great at like quick check-ins and stuff, but they really struggle with deeper emotional expression,
Right.
or others might be amazing at virtual dates and stuff, but less skilled at like navigating conflict from afar.
Yeah.
So figuring out your communication strengths and weaknesses as a couple is key.
Right. And it's like, I feel like in a regular relationship,
Yeah.
you can rely on nonverbal cues and
Yeah.
physical touch to kind of convey certain emotions. But with distance, you have to be so much more intentional with your
Absolutely.
firmly. Have you noticed any patterns in how couples successfully communicate?
One thing that often comes up is the importance of establishing clear expectations
Well,
around communication frequency and style.
God.
Some couples thrive on like daily check-ins, while others find that totally overwhelming.
Yeah.
So it's about finding that rhythm that works for both partners and being adaptable as needs change over time.
So it's less about like a set formula and more about
Exactly.
understanding what works for like the dynamic.
Yeah, the specific dynamic
Like
of that
that.
couple.
Yeah, I like that. So it seems like the podcast also emphasizes the importance of virtual dates and like being creative with activities. But how do you make those feel genuine and not just like a chore that you're checking off your
Right. That's a good question.
list?
Yeah. I think that's where tapping into shared interests
Okay.
becomes super important. The podcast gives examples like cooking the same meal together virtually
Okay.
or watching a movie simultaneously while chatting.
Right.
But, what are you both passionate about?
Mm-hmm.
Can you find ways to experience those passions together,
Yeah.
even from afar?
I love that.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So maybe
Yeah.
it's taking like a virtual museum tour
Uh-huh.
or attending like an online concert or even just like reading the same book
Yeah.
and discussing it.
I love that. It's making those activities an extension of like your shared connection
Exactly.
rather than just trying to replicate like a normal date.
Right. It's not about just like checking the boxes. It's
Yeah.
about really connecting.
Totally.
Mm.
And it's about being present and engaged in those virtual interactions, like putting away your phone, minimizing distractions, and really like focusing on your partner.
Couldn't agree more. It's so easy to let those distractions creep in.
It is, yeah.
But being intentional with your time, even virtually, can make a huge difference.
So true. And speaking of intentionality, the podcast talks about planning visits. Why is that so crucial in making long distance work?
Well, having those concrete plans to look forward to can be a huge emotional boost.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that the distance is temporary
Right.
and that you will be reunited.
Mm-hmm.
And it gives you something tangible to work towards and dream about together.
That makes sense. It's like having a light at the end of the tunnel,
Right.
knowing that you'll be physically together again soon. But what about the times when that reunion feels so far off?
Yeah.
How do you navigate those day-to-day challenges of being apart, like
Yeah.
loneliness or potential trust issues?
Right.
the podcast touches on this, right?
It does, and it
Mhm.
acknowledges that those are very real hurdles. You know, it's easy to feel disconnected and even start to question the relationship
Right.
when you're not physically present in each other's lives.
So how do you combat those feelings? Does the podcast
Mm.
offer any specific advice?
Well, it highlights the importance of transparency and open communication,
Okay.
especially when it comes to trust. You
Mhm.
know, sharing your worries and insecurities rather than bottling them up can help prevent misunderstandings.
Got it.
And it goes both ways, too, you know, being receptive to your partner's concerns and offering reassurance.
Right. So it's about creating a safe space where
Exactly.
you can be vulnerable
Yes.
even when you're
Even when you're miles apart.
miles apart.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's about finding ways to stay connected on an emotional level,
Yes.
even when physical intimacy is
That-
off the table.
Right. That's so important. It's easy to get caught up in like the logistics of making long distance work, like the visits,
Yeah.
the communication schedules.
Mhm.
But nurturing that emotional connection is what really sustains the relationship. Absolutely.
I'm curious to hear more about that success story the podcast mentions. What made their
Yeah.
long-distance experience so successful? Did they have any specific strategies or techniques that stood out?
Well, what's fascinating about their story is they were incredibly intentional about building a shared future.
Oh, I love that. Tell me more about that. How did they do that? What did it look like for them?
So they talked about their long-term goals, you know, made financial plans together, and even started looking at real estate
Wow,
in the city where they plan to eventually, like, settle down.
that's impressive. So they weren't just living in the moment of being apart.
Right.
They were actively building a future together.
Exactly.
Did they mention anything about how they handled conflict or disagreements from a distance?
Mm-hmm.
That seems particularly tricky.
Yeah, they emphasize the importance of addressing issues head on
Okay.
rather than letting them fester.
Right.
And they also talked about how they developed their own kind of conflict resolution protocol, which included things like taking a break to cool down if things got heated
Well,
and using video calls whenever possible to allow for like nonverbal cues.
that's so smart.
Yeah.
It's like they created their own personalized system
Yeah.
for navigating the unique challenges
Exactly.
of long-distance conflict.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like this couple really had a strong foundation of communication and trust.
Yeah.
But what about those who might be starting from scratch?
Right.
What advice would you give to someone just beginning a long-distance relationship?
One thing I would emphasize is the importance of setting realistic expectations from the outset.
Okay.
You know, long distance is not for the faint of heart.
Right.
It requires effort, patience, and a willingness to adapt.
Got it.
It's crucial to have honest conversations about your needs, your boundaries, and your expectations for communication.
So you're almost creating like a roadmap together,
Yeah.
acknowledging that the terrain might be bumpy at times,
Right.
but you've got a plan for navigating those
Yes.
challenges. I think a lot of people worry about maintaining intimacy and connection when physical touch is limited.
Uh-huh.
Did the podcast address this at all?
Yes, and it offered some really insightful perspectives. I
Okay.
think the key takeaway was that physical intimacy is just one aspect of a multifaceted connection.
Right.
In long-distance relationships, other forms of intimacy become even more vital.
Okay.
Things like emotional intimacy,
Yeah.
intellectual intimacy,
Yeah.
and even spiritual intimacy.
That's such an important point. It's about expanding your definition of intimacy beyond the physical.
Absolutely.
What are some practical ways that couples can cultivate those other forms of intimacy from a distance?
The podcast suggested things like having deep, meaningful conversations,
Okay.
sharing personal stories and dreams,
Uh-huh.
engaging in activities that stimulate your minds,
Yeah.
or even exploring shared spiritual practices like meditation or prayer.
Right.
It's about finding those points of connection that go beyond the surface level.
I love that. It's about remembering that intimacy is about truly seeing and being seen by your partner
Yes.
on multiple levels. Did the podcast talk about the importance of maintaining a sense of individuality while also nurturing the relationship? That seems like a delicate.
It did. And it emphasized that one of the potential perks of long distance
Okay.
is that it allows you to pursue your own interests and goals without feeling like you're sacrificing the relationship.
That's a really interesting perspective. It's like instead of viewing the distance as a barrier, you can see it as an opportunity for growth and self-discovery.
Exactly. And it can actually strengthen the relationship in the long run.
How so?
When you have the space to grow as individuals, you bring even more to the table as a couple.
That's a great point. You're not just two halves trying to become whole.
Right.
You're two whole individuals
Yes.
choosing to come together and share your lives. I'm curious, did the podcast mention any potential pitfalls
Yeah.
or red flags to watch out for in long-distance relationships?
It highlighted the importance of being aware of potential power imbalances,
Okay.
especially if one partner is significantly more invested in closing the distance
That makes sense.
than the other.
Resentment could easily build if one person feels like they're
For sure.
making all the sacrifices or compromises.
Right. And it's also important to be mindful of how you're handling conflict.
Mhm.
You know, it's easy to fall into patterns of avoidance or passive aggression
Yeah.
when you're not physically present to address issues head on.
It's almost like the distance can magnify those communication challenges
Exactly.
if you're not careful.
And it's also important to just be honest with yourself
Yeah.
about whether you're truly compatible as a couple, regardless of the distance.
Right.
Long distance can exacerbate existing issues.
Totally.
So it's crucial to have a solid foundation of trust, respect, and shared values.
That's such a crucial point. Distance can sometimes mask underlying problems
Uh-huh.
that might become more apparent
Yes,
once you're geographically closer.
for sure.
So it's not a magical solution for fixing a struggling relationship.
Right.
But for couples who are solid and committed, it seems like long distance can actually be a catalyst
Absolutely.
for even deeper connection.
It can. And it can teach you valuable life skills like communication, patience, and resilience that can benefit you in all areas of your life.
It's like you're putting your relationship through a kind of pressure test.
Yeah,
And if it can withstand the heat of distance, it's likely to emerge even stronger.
exactly. And it's important to remember that every relationship,
Yeah.
whether long distance or geographically close, will have its ups and downs.
It's all part of the journey, right? The challenges, the triumphs,
It is.
the moments of connection, and the times when you might feel disconnected.
Yeah.
It's all part of the tapestry of love.
Beautifully said. And speaking of journeys, I think it's time for us to take a short pause
Okay.
before we wrap up our deep dive. Stay tuned for some final thoughts and takeaways.
Okay. And we are back. Ready to kind of wrap things up for our deep dive into long-distance relationships.
Yeah, it's been a really fascinating conversation.
It has. I feel like we've challenged some assumptions and uncovered some hidden strengths and really gained a deeper understanding of what it takes to make these relationships work.
Totally. And you know, we've seen that long distance isn't just about enduring separation.
Right.
It's about actively cultivating a connection that can flourish
Yeah.
despite the distance.
And communication, intentionality, and a shared vision for the future are key.
Absolutely.
I think one of the most powerful takeaways for me was the idea that long distance can be an opportunity for growth, both individually and as a couple.
Yeah.
It pushes you to develop those communication skills, to prioritize emotional intimacy, and to become more resourceful and resilient.
Like a crash course in relationship skills.
It is. It
Yeah.
really is. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one piece of advice
Okay.
you would give to someone considering a long-distance relationship or maybe even struggling with one?
Okay. I would say be honest with yourself and your partner about your needs, your expectations, and your commitment level. Long distance requires a certain level of emotional maturity, self-awareness, and a willingness to put in the work.
Yeah,
It's not a magical solution for a struggling relationship,
right.
but it can be an incredible opportunity for growth and connection
Yeah,
if both partners are on the same page.
totally. It's about going into it with eyes wide open,
Yeah.
understanding the challenges,
Yeah,
but also embracing the potential rewards.
for sure.
And it's about remembering that every relationship, whether long distance or geographically close, is a journey.
Absolutely. There will be ups and downs, moments of joy and moments of frustration.
Right.
But if you're both committed to making it work,
Yeah.
if you're willing to communicate openly, and if you have a shared vision for the future, then love can truly conquer any distance.
And isn't that a beautiful thought? That love knows no bounds. That even when separated by miles, heart can still beat in unison. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you gained some valuable insights and perhaps even a renewed sense of hope for the power of love to bridge any distance.